Picture yourself on the edge of a medieval battlefield, the ground trembling beneath your feet as two armies prepare to clash. The air is heavy with the scent of sweat and steel, the tension so thick you could cut it with a dagger. Then, without warning, a sound cuts through the silence, deep, rhythmic drumbeats that echo like the heartbeat of war itself, followed by the sharp, commanding blare of trumpets. This wasn't just noise, it was a calculated assault on the senses, a weapon as powerful as any sword or arrow. Music in medieval warfare wasn't merely for ceremony or morale. It was a strategic force, a tool that could rally allies, terrify enemies, and even turn the tide of battle with nothing but sound. Think about the sheer power of that moment, the way a well-timed drum roll could send shivers down the spine of even the bravest knight, or how a chorus of war horns could make an entire army feel invincible. These weren't random notes, they were carefully crafted psychological weapons. Commanders used music to send secret signals across chaotic battlefields, coordinating movements without a single shouted order. They knew that the right melody could stir courage in their own troops while sowing doubt and confusion in the enemy's ranks. And sometimes, the most terrifying weapon wasn't a volley of arrows. It was the deafening roar of hundreds of voices chanting in unison, a wall of sound meant to break the will of those who heard it. Today, we're going to unravel the hidden symphony of medieval warfare, exploring how music shaped the strategies and outcomes of history's most pivotal battles. From the haunting bagpipes that led Scottish clans into combat to the thunderous kettledrums that announced the arrival of Ottoman armies, sound was a language of power and intimidation. We'll uncover how musicians became unsung heroes on the battlefield, how certain instruments were feared as much as any siege engine, and why the absence of music could be just as telling as its presence. This is a story of innovation, psychology, and the unexpected ways humans have harnessed art for war. So lean in and listen closely, because history isn't just something you read. Sometimes it's something you hear. Long before the grand orchestras of later centuries, music in medieval Europe had a far more urgent purpose: survival on the battlefield. The roots of military music stretch back to ancient Rome, where the raucous blare of horns like the cornu and tuba cut through the chaos of war, signaling orders to legions spread across vast distances. But it was the medieval world that transformed these raw sounds into something far more sophisticated. Imagine the scene: monks in candlelit scriptoriums meticulously copying musical notation, preserving the sacred chants of the church, while just beyond monastery walls, armored knights tested how those same rhythms could command an army. This unlikely marriage of sacred and martial traditions gave birth to instruments designed for war. Take the buicine, a towering trumpet often stretching over 6 feet long. Its piercing tone could carry for miles, rallying scattered troops or warning of an ambush. Then there were the nakers, small kettle drums strapped to horseback, their thunderous beats syncing with the gallop of charging cavalry. These weren't just tools, they were extensions of a commander's voice, cutting through the din of clashing steel and screaming men. Even the humble bagpipe, now associated with festive parades, once terrified enemies with its eerie wail, especially in the hands of Scottish Highlanders, who used its relentless drone to unnerve foes before the first sword was drawn. But why did music become so central to medieval warfare? The answer lies in the sheer chaos of battle. Without radios or satellites, armies relied on sound to coordinate movements. A precise trumpet call could order a flank to advance or retreat without a single rider risking their life to deliver the message. And it wasn't just about logistics. The psychological impact was just as critical. The sudden roar of drums or a chorus of war horns could make a small force sound like an unstoppable horde, shaking the confidence of even seasoned soldiers. In an age where superstition and belief in the supernatural ran deep, the right music could feel like divine intervention or a curse from hell itself. What's fascinating is how these sounds crossed cultural boundaries. The Islamic world's use of loud nafirs and tabal drums during the Crusades mirrored Europe's tactics, proving that music's power in war was universal. Even the Vikings, often depicted as silent raiders in popular media, used lyre horns to coordinate their infamous longships. By the High Middle Ages, no army worth its salt marched without musicians. Their rhythms and melodies were as vital as swords or shields. This wasn't just background noise, it was the soundtrack of conquest, a language every soldier understood. Imagine trying to shout orders over the roar of thousands of soldiers, the clang of armor, and the screams of horses. It would be nearly impossible. That's why medieval commanders turned music into their most reliable battlefield communication system. Unlike spoken words lost in the chaos, a single trumpet blast or drum pattern could cut through the noise with crystal clarity, delivering life or death commands in an instant. These weren't just random sounds, they were a precise language as structured as any modern military code. Take the English longbowmen at Agincourt. Before loosing their deadly volleys, they waited for a specific trumpet call, a high, piercing note that meant draw and fire. Miss that signal and their arrows would fall out of sync, wasting precious ammunition. Or consider the Swiss pikemen, whose drumbeats dictated the exact rhythm of their advance, keeping their infamous phalanxes locked in perfect formation. Even the simple act of retreat required musical precision. A series of short, urgent horn blasts told scattered troops to regroup without panic, while a single sustained note might signal an orderly withdrawal. The wrong call could turn an organized maneuver into a deadly rout, but music's role went beyond basic commands. Armies developed entire libraries of secret signals, like musical passwords to prevent friendly fire in the thick of battle. During the Crusades, Templar knights used distinct chord sequences to identify themselves when visibility was low. A wrong note could mean facing your own allies' swords. Some commanders even composed unique melodies for different divisions, so soldiers could locate their units by sound alone. And the stakes couldn't have been higher, legend says. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, misheard trumpet calls led to a disastrous cavalry charge straight into an Ottoman trap, dooming the Crusader army. The musicians themselves were anything but background players. Positioned on hills or horseback for maximum reach, they had to memorize hundreds of calls and play them flawlessly under the stress of combat. A missed note or mistimed drumbeat could scatter an entire battalion. That's why the best were often paid as much as skilled knights. Their instruments were the nervous system of the army. In some cultures, like the Ottoman Janissaries, military bands held elite status. Their thunderous meta music so vital that losing them in battle was seen as a catastrophic omen. What's truly remarkable is how universal this language became. From the Mongols' horsehair fiddles guiding their nomadic armies to the Spanish atabales drums coordinating tercio formations, every culture refined its own sonic shorthand. Even enemies could sometimes read each other's signals during the 100 Years' War. French and English archers reportedly learned to recognize opposing trumpet calls, turning music into a deadly game of anticipation and countermove. This was warfare conducted not just with steel but with sound, a symphony of survival where every note carried the weight of victory or defeat. There's a reason the drum was called the heartbeat of war, because when it stopped, armies often died. Picture the moment, a line of soldiers frozen in place, not by a command but by silence. The absence of that relentless thump was as jarring as a scream in the night. Drums weren't just timekeepers, they were psychological weapons, tools of terror as much as tools of order. Take the Ottoman curse, massive kettle drums so large they had to be carried on camels. When the Janissaries marched, these drums didn't just sound. They shook the earth, their deep, resonant booms mimicking the footsteps of an approaching giant. To an enemy hidden behind castle walls or huddled in a foggy valley, that sound wasn't just noise. It was the illusion of an unstoppable force, a monster breathing down their necks. But drums also worked their magic on the soldiers who relied on them. A steady, unwavering beat could turn a mob of frightened recruits into a single, unstoppable machine. Swiss mercenaries, some of the most feared infantry in Europe, marched to the precise rhythm of timbres, their pikes rising and falling like clockwork. That hypnotic cadence did more than keep time, it erased doubt. When every step lands in perfect unison, when your breath syncs with the drum, individuality vanishes. You become part of something larger, something unbreakable. That's why losing a drummer in battle was catastrophic. Without that anchor, formations splintered, courage wavered, and the illusion of invincibility crumbled. The genius of war drums lay in their duality. They could be both comfort and weapon, depending on who was listening. To allies, the rhythm was a lifeline, a constant reminder of order in the chaos. But to enemies, that same sound was a taunt, a threat, a countdown to annihilation. During the Siege of Vienna in 1683, Ottoman Meta bands played ceaselessly, their drums and cymbals blending into a wall of noise meant to exhaust and demoralize the defenders. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Polish hussars used their own drums to stoke fury, speeding up the tempo to whip their cavalry into a frenzy before a charge. Fear, after all, isn't just about volume, it's about rhythm. A slow, deliberate beat could tighten throats with dread, while a sudden, frantic roll signaled impending doom. Even the materials of these drums were chosen for psychological impact. Animal skins stretched over wooden frames weren't just practical, they carried symbolism. Some cultures believed the spirits of the beasts lived on in the drumheads, lending their ferocity to the music. Others, like the Mongol armies, used drums made from the hides of enemies, turning the instrument into a literal echo of conquest. And when those drums fell silent, whether from a stray arrow or a retreat, the effect was profound. Silence on the battlefield wasn't peace, it was the moment before collapse, the breath held too long. Armies knew this, that's why drummers were often targeted first, why their deaths could unravel an entire flank. Because in the end, war isn't just fought with blades and arrows. It's fought in the chest, in the pulse, in the spaces between each thunderous beat. A single trumpet echoing through a misty valley could unravel an entire army's resolve. This was the power of acoustic deception, turning empty air into an invisible army. Medieval commanders understood something profound. In the fog of war, perception often mattered more than reality. By scattering just a handful of trumpeters across rocky terrain or dense forests, they could conjure the illusion of endless reinforcements. The Mongols elevated this to an art form. Their Narchai horns, crafted from brass or animal horns, didn't just carry orders, they carried dread. When their cavalry circled a fortified town, trumpeters would position themselves at staggered intervals, blasting short, overlapping calls. The result, a disorienting chorus that made it seem like the horde was everywhere at once. Defenders would peer into the distance, seeing nothing but shadows, yet hearing what sounded like columns of warriors closing in from all sides. But the genius lay in the details. These weren't random noises, each call had purpose. A rapid series of high-pitched blasts might mimic the signals of advancing scouts, while long, mournful notes could imply distant troops rallying. In the thick of a forest where vision was limited to a few yards, sound became the ultimate weapon. The French learned this the hard way during the 100 Years' War, when English archers used hidden trumpeters to simulate flanking maneuvers, tricking knights into charging empty stretches of woodland. Even seasoned commanders couldn't resist the primal pull of their own ears. After all, the human brain is wired to trust sound over sight when danger looms, a survival instinct medieval armies exploited ruthlessly. Siege warfare took this psychological play to another level. Picture a castle under attack, its defenders tense on the walls, scanning the horizon for movement. Then, from nowhere, a trumpet shrieks, close enough to freeze blood, yet with no visible source. Was it a lone scout, the vanguard of a tunneling party? Or worse, the signal for an assault from an unseen direction? Ottoman besiegers were masters of this game. During the fall of Constantinople, they positioned Zurna players in concealed trenches, their shrill, reedy notes slicing through the night. Each blast sowed doubt, exhausting defenders who couldn't afford to ignore a potential threat. Sleep-deprived and jumpy, even the bravest soldiers would start seeing phantoms in every shadow. What made these tricks so devastating was their simplicity. No expensive siege engines, no complex tactics, just an understanding of how sound bends reality. The Welsh knew this when they used curved Carinx horns to amplify their war cries, making tiny bands of warriors sound like legions. The Swiss, famed for their discipline, still fell victim to Habsburg forces who mimicked their retreat signals with counterfeit trumpet calls. Even nature conspired to sell the illusion. A valley might stretch and twist a single note into a ghostly choir, while a sudden gust of wind could make distant horns seem alarmingly near. In the end, the most effective weapon wasn't always steel. It was the space between notes, the silence that left enemies imagining the worst. The human voice may be the oldest weapon of all, no instrument needed, just lungs and conviction. Picture the moment before battle, ranks of soldiers gripping their weapons, hearts pounding, the air thick with dread. Then one voice rises, a deep, guttural chant, and suddenly 50 more join in, then 100, until the ground itself seems to vibrate with the sound. This wasn't just noise, it was alchemy, turning raw terror into unshakable resolve. The Crusaders knew this power well. Their cry of Deus lo vult, God wills it, wasn't merely a slogan, it was a battle hymn, a mantra that fused faith and fury into a single purpose. When thousands shouted it in unison, doubt burned away like morning fog. They weren't just soldiers anymore, they were a divine instrument, and that belief could march them through hell itself. But chanting wasn't always about courage. Sometimes it was about cruelty. Take the Swiss Kurehin, haunting melodies originally sung by alpine herders to call their cattle home. On the battlefield, these same tunes became psychological warfare. Swiss pikemen would advance in eerie silence, then erupt into those familiar pastoral refrains at close range, their voices twisting something comforting into something grotesque. To enemies who knew the songs from childhood, the effect was paralyzing, like hearing a lullaby sung by a ghost. The message was clear: you are not fighting men. You are prey. Other cultures weaponized nostalgia too. Welsh warriors used layered harmonies to disorient foes, their interlocking chants creating a sonic maze that frayed nerves before the first arrow flew. The true genius of these vocal rituals lay in their simplicity. No drums to carry, no trumpets to signal, just bodies and breath. A well-timed chant could rally broken troops faster than any banner. During the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, the Teutonic Knights' Latin hymns faltered as Lithuanian forces answered with thunderous pagan chants. their voices swelling like a storm. In that moment, the knights' disciplined ranks wavered, not from steel, but from sound. Similarly, Ottoman janissaries recited rhythmic dhikr prayers before combat, their synchronized breaths and words syncing heartbeats across the entire unit. When they finally charged, they moved as one living blade. And then there were the chants never meant for enemy ears, secret cadences whispered in the dark to steady, shaking hands. Norse berserkers reportedly growled animalistic verses to summon their famed battle trances, while Mongol horsemen sang low, droning songs to calm their mounts and themselves before the chaos of the charge. Even the absence of chanting spoke volumes. When the French Oriflamme banner was raised, their usual war cries ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it signaled imminent slaughter. In the end, these weren't just songs or slogans, they were spells, weaving collective will into something sharper than any sword. A single voice might tremble, but 100 voices rising together could shake the heavens. To stand on a medieval battlefield as the Te Deum began was to witness the supernatural made audible. This ancient hymn, its Latin verses rolling like thunder across the field, wasn't just a prayer, it was a declaration of divine alliance. Imagine the scene, armored knights kneeling in the mud, their voices rising with priests in solemn unison, while across the field, enemy soldiers heard those sacred melodies and wondered if heaven itself had taken sides. Sacred music in war wasn't about inspiration, it was about summoning. When the Crusaders marched on Jerusalem, their chaplains led them in chanting Psalm 144, "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war." To them, this wasn't metaphor. Every note was a weapon, every verse a shield. The psychological weight of these rituals could unravel armies before the first blow landed. Take the Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa in 1212, where Castilian troops knelt to sing Veni Creator Spiritus at dawn. As the hymn's echoes faded, the Almohad forces who'd mocked the Christians' piety moments earlier reportedly faltered, their confidence shaken by the eerie certainty in those voices. Sacred music created a terrifying calculus for opponents. If these men believed God sang with them, how could mere mortals stand in their way? Even the Vikings, who mocked Christian weakness, grew wary when Frankish armies advanced behind choruses of Christus Vincit. To pagan ears, that relentless chanting carried the menace of an invisible army marching alongside the visible one, but the holiest songs often hid the darkest pragmatism. Clerics knew that timing was everything. The Dies Irae, with its visions of divine wrath, was strategically deployed during sieges to magnify defenders' despair. At the siege of Antioch, Crusader priests sang it through the night, its grim prophecies seeping through the walls like a curse. Conversely, the Gloria in Excelsis Deo might erupt after a surprise victory, its jubilant notes convincing both sides the outcome was preordained. This wasn't just morale building, it was theater with heaven as the ultimate stagehand. The most chilling effect of sacred warfare music was its duality. To believers, it was a lifeline to the divine. To enemies, it could sound like their own funeral dirge. When the Teutonic Knights faced Lithuanian pagans, they deliberately sang the Salve Regina in slow, mournful tones, a melody their foes associated with Christian burial rites. The message was cruel and clear: we are singing you into the ground. Even instruments took on sacred menace. The great organs of Burgundy's armies didn't just play hymns, their deepest pipes were tuned to mimic the Vox Dei, the voice of God, a sound so low it vibrated in the chest like impending judgment. Yet for all its power, this sonic faith had one fatal flaw. When divine music failed to deliver victory, its spell shattered. After the disastrous Battle of Hattin, where Crusader priests sang even as Saladin's forces encircled them, survivors spoke of hymns turning to ash in their mouths. Sacred warfare music was the ultimate gamble, a bet that heaven would amplify what mortal hands could not. And when silence followed the singing, even the devoutest soldiers learned a harrowing lesson. God might listen to battle hymns, but he didn't always answer. Silence on the medieval battlefield wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a weapon finely sharpened by cunning commanders. Imagine standing guard on castle walls after days of relentless drumming, your nerves frayed from the constant thrum of siege music. Then, without warning, the noise stops. No fading, no final crescendo, just a void where sound used to be. That sudden hush was more terrifying than any war cry, because in the silence, every creak of armor, every distant footstep became a potential death sentence. Defenders would strain their ears, hearts pounding, wondering if the quiet meant their enemies were tunneling beneath the walls, or worse, preparing for a final, brutal assault. The absence of noise didn't bring relief, it bred paranoia. This was sonic warfare at its most subtle. Skilled besiegers knew that predictability bred complacency, so they played with sound like a cat with a mouse. The Ottomans mastered this during the Siege of Belgrade in 1456, where their famed Mater band played without pause for 3 straight days, then fell silent at midnight. Hungarian defenders, lulled into a false sense of routine, scrambled in panic at the sudden quiet, convinced an attack was coming from the darkness, but no strike came. The silence itself was the attack, draining the garrison's stamina as surely as any battering ram. Conversely, some armies turned silence into a cloak of invisibility. Scottish Highlanders, often outnumbered in their raids, would approach English camps with muffled drums, animal skins stuffed with moss to deaden the sound. The effect was eerie, an entire fighting force moving like ghosts through the heather, their presence betrayed only by the glint of moonlight on steel. The Venetians used similar tactics during night assaults, their oarsmen rowing in perfect, soundless unison until the moment of attack. When silence broke, it wasn't with a war cry, but with the first screams of surprised sentries. The genius of these tactics lay in their manipulation of human instinct. We're wired to fear the unknown, and nothing is more unknown than what we can't hear. A silent advance played on that primal dread, turning shadows into threats. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, Swiss rebels ambushed Habsburg knights by descending a mountain in utter quiet, their approach masked by thick fog. The first the knights knew of their doom was the crunch of Swiss halberds slicing through armor. No war drums, no shouts, just the horrifying realization they'd been hunted in perfect silence. Even the natural world became an accomplice in these sonic deceptions. A sudden lull in wind could make distant armies seem to vanish, while an opportune thunderclap might mask the march of troops. During the Wars of the Roses, Yorkist archers famously held their breath en masse before loosing volleys, turning the hiss of arrows into the first warning of death. And when silence was finally broken, whether by a single arrow's whistle or 100 swords being drawn, the shock could paralyze an enemy faster than any charge. In the end, the most powerful sound in medieval warfare wasn't a note at all, but the space between notes. It was the moment when musicians lowered their instruments, when war cries died on lips, when defenders realized the music had stopped and the killing was about to begin. There's something uniquely unsettling about a sound you can't place, a noise that doesn't fit the world as you know it. Now imagine that sound swelling from the mist, jagged and shrill, like the scream of some unseen creature. That was the psychological power of the bagpipes in medieval warfare, a weapon crafted not from steel, but from sheer auditory strangeness. To English soldiers facing the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314, the pipes weren't just loud, they were alien, their droning reeds and piercing chanters cutting through the familiar clamor of battle like a blade through flesh. This wasn't music as they understood it. It was chaos given sound, and it turned disciplined formations into disoriented mobs. The genius of the bagpipe as a war instrument lay in its physicality. Unlike trumpets or drums, which project clean, recognizable tones, the pipe's continuous drone created by air squeezed from the player's arm into the bag created a wall of noise with no beginning or end. Add the shrill melody of the chanter, and you had a sound that refused to resolve, like a nightmare that wouldn't break. Scottish Highlanders knew this well. Before charging, pipers would play Piabaracht, a style of music meant to mimic the wails of banshees, their fingers flying over the chanter to produce jagged, dissonant notes. To enemies raised on the orderly hymns of church choirs or the straightforward calls of military horns, this was auditory witchcraft, and in the heat of battle, where nerves were already frayed, that unearthly wail could unravel courage faster than any cavalry charge. But the terror of unfamiliar sounds wasn't just a Scottish tactic. Irish war pipes served a similar purpose. Their deeper, more resonant tones signaled guerrilla attacks, appearing suddenly from forests or hillsides to make small bands of fighters seem like spectral hordes. The psychological effect was brutal. Soldiers would spin toward the sound, expecting an attack from one direction, only to be struck from another. This was sound as misdirection, turning the landscape itself into an instrument of fear. Even the pipe's construction played into the dread. Made from the skins of goats or sheep, their drones sometimes still clinging to tufts of fur, they blurred the line between tool and living thing, as if the battlefield had sprouted new, monstrous voices. What made these tactics so effective was the dehumanization they bred. When an enemy's music feels inhuman, it's easier to see them as inhuman. Chroniclers of the Crusades wrote of European knights freezing at the first heard notes of Islamic nafir trumpets, their coiled shapes producing tones that seemed to writhe in the air. Similarly, Mongol horse head fiddles with their eerie, whistling harmonics made advancing riders sound less like an army and more like a gathering of spirits. Fear of the unknown isn't just about danger, it's about the collapse of understanding. When the sounds of war defy expectation, they strip away the comforting illusion of control, leaving only primal dread. And that's why, even today, the skirl of bagpipes can send a shiver down the spine. It's not just volume or melody, it's memory buried deep in our collective past. Somewhere in our bones, we still remember what it meant to hear the unearthly wail of the pipes rolling toward us across a darkening field, and to know with cold certainty that the rules of the world had changed. The worst fate for a besieged town wasn't always starvation or thirst sometimes. It was simply never being allowed to close your eyes. Imagine the horror of enduring day after day under a ceaseless barrage of horns, drums, and deliberately off-key instruments, each note calculated to fray nerves like a saw against bone. This was siege warfare's cruelest symphony, music stripped of all artistry, reduced to nothing but relentless, sleep-shattering noise. Chroniclers of the 100 Years' War describe French forces encircling English-held castles with bands of musicians playing in shifts, ensuring the cacophony never paused, even for a heartbeat. Defenders would collapse at their posts, hallucinating from exhaustion, while children inside the walls sobbed uncontrollably at sounds that never let them rest. The message was clear: surrender wasn't just an option, it was the only escape from auditory hell. Some commanders took this psychological torture to grotesque heights. During the Siege of Neuss in 1474, Burgundian Duke Charles the Bold commissioned composers to create what one monk's journal called the devil's own music, a discordant harmonies intentionally designed to grate on the ear. Picture strings tuned slightly sharp, horns blaring in clashing keys, and percussionists hammering rhythmic patterns that made the skin crawl. This wasn't just noise pollution, It was acoustic waterboarding, turning the very air into an instrument of torment. The effect was so devastating that after 3 sleepless nights, the town's magistrates reportedly begged for terms, their resolve broken not by swords but by sound. The science behind this torment is chillingly modern. Studies now show that irregular, unpredictable noises, like those crafted by medieval siege musicians, trigger the brain's threat response far more than steady sounds. Defenders subjected to this sonic assault didn't just grow tired. Their cortisol levels spiked, their immune systems weakened, and their decision-making crumbled. The Ottomans weaponized this brilliantly during the Siege of Rhodes, where their meter bands alternated between deafening crescendos and sudden silences, keeping defenders perpetually off balance. Sleep deprivation became a tactical ally after a week of this torment. Even seasoned knights would mistake shadows for attackers, or worse, turn on their own comrades in delirium. But perhaps the most sinister twist was how these tactics blurred the line between war and ritual. In some sieges, besiegers would play religious hymns their enemies knew well, but twisted into minor keys or sung at grotesquely slowed tempos. To defenders clinging to faith for courage, hearing their sacred music distorted was a spiritual violation, as if the enemy had poisoned their prayers. During the Albigensian Crusade, Catholic forces reportedly did this with Provençal troubadour songs, turning the culture they were erasing into a weapon against itself. The message was unmistakable. Even the things you love can be turned against you. What's haunting is how these medieval tactics echo in modern warfare, from the American military's use of blasted rock music during the Panama invasion to the sonic booms Israel employs over Gaza. The technology changes, but the principle remains. Sound can be a prison without walls, and in the Middle Ages, where superstition magnified every unexplained noise, that prison's bars were made of pure dread. A defender might brave arrows or fire, but when the enemy's drums kept time with your racing heart, when their trumpets mimicked the screams of the dying, surrender wasn't defeat. It was the only way to make the screaming in your skull stop. A minstrel tuning his lute in a crowded hall wasn't just preparing to entertain, he was sharpening a weapon far more subtle than any blade. These traveling musicians, welcomed in castles and campfires alike, carried something more dangerous than songs, secrets. With their brightly colored garb and reputation for frivolity, minstrels were the last people medieval lords suspected of espionage, which made them perfect for the job. They slipped past guards with ease, their melodies masking the real performance, the careful memorization of troop numbers, the casual eavesdropping on drunken knights boasting of battle plans, even the discreet counting of supply carts rolling through gates. To the untrained eye, they were just entertainers. To commanders in the know, they were invisible scribes, recording every detail in the one place no one would search, their music. The true brilliance lay in how they communicated their findings. A minstrel couldn't simply march into an allied camp and start reciting enemy positions that would risk exposure. Instead, they wove intelligence into their art. A seemingly innocent love ballad might describe a path through the western woods, subtly indicating the weakest point in a fortress's defenses. A cheerful drinking song could repeat the phrase, "3 black crows," to signal enemy cavalry numbers. Even tempo held meaning. Slowing a refrain might warn of delayed reinforcements, while a sudden, spirited finish could mean attack was imminent. This wasn't just creativity, it was survival. One slip, one overly literal lyric, and the minstrel's next performance might be on the gallows, but the risks didn't stop at coded messages. Some minstrels doubled as smugglers, their instrument cases hiding more than strings and reeds. Records from the War of the Roses mention a lute confiscated in York with a false bottom containing a map of secret tunnels beneath the city walls. Another account describes a German minnesinger whose oversized hurdy-gurdy concealed daggers for assassins. The instruments themselves could be weapons, specialized pipes with compartments for poison, or harps strung with wire strong enough to garrote. Yet the most valuable cargo was always information. A French chronicle tells of a minstrel who memorized the layout of an English castle by composing a mnemonic song, each verse corresponding to a tower or gate, which he later sang for his paymasters note by note. What made minstrel spies so effective was their dual identity. In an era where social roles were rigid, their profession granted rare fluidity. They could share a drink with common soldiers one night and perform for nobility the next, their status as entertainers rendering them almost invisible to both. The Venetian Doge spies even maintained a network of minstrels across Europe, their reports hidden in the decorative scrollwork of sheet music. And when wars ended, these covert operatives simply faded back into their public roles, their wartime deeds lost to all but the most cryptic ballads. After all, the best spies never make the history books, they write the songs instead. The legacy of these musical double agents lingers in unexpected ways. The children's game Ring Around the Rosie, some scholars argue, may have originated as coded plague warnings spread by minstrels. Even the term dead drop finds eerie precedent in medieval troubadours leaving messages tucked into the sound holes of church organs. But perhaps the most enduring testament to their skill is how thoroughly their secrets stayed hidden. For every minstrel spy we know of, a dozen likely took their true missions to the grave, their stories buried in plain sight between the lines of 1,000 forgotten verses. Consider the sheer genius of hiding a battle plan in plain hearing. In an age without radios or secure channels, medieval commanders turned music into a living cipher, a sequence of notes that could carry secrets across enemy lines without raising suspicion. The Templar Knights, renowned for their secrecy, reportedly encoded messages within the very fabric of Gregorian chants. To the pious ear, it was divine worship. To a trained brother, the rise and fall of certain phrases might reveal the location of hidden reinforcements or the identity of a traitor within their ranks. A single sustained note in the Agnus Dei could mean hold position, while an unexpected trill might warn of poisoned supplies. The beauty of this system lay in its deniability. Even if an enemy intercepted the music, they'd hear only prayer, not plotting. But musical codes weren't just for elites. On the muddy battlefields of the 100 Years' War, common soldiers relied on folk tunes with altered lyrics to pass urgent warnings. A shepherd's flute melody played too fast might signal scouts spotting enemy cavalry, while a familiar drinking song missing its third verse could mean the tavern is poisoned, code for a compromised safe house. The Welsh took this a step further with their Panillion tradition, where harpists competed to improvise verses over set melodies. To outsiders, it was entertainment. To rebels resisting English rule, the winning verse often contained coded instructions for upcoming raids, hidden in metaphors about the weather or livestock. The most sophisticated systems treated music like a lock and key. Byzantine generals allegedly used the octoechos, a complex system of 8 musical modes, to encrypt orders. A message might be split across multiple melodies, each assigned to different musicians, so that only when played together would the full plan emerge. Similarly, during the Reconquista, Spanish spies embedded in Moorish courts used flamenco's Polo's rhythms sola for gathered troops, allegrias for false retreat, to coordinate without speaking a word. The risk of discovery was ever present. A single missed note or botched rhythm could scramble the message entirely, with disastrous consequences. At the siege of Antioch, a crusader's mistimed horn call reportedly sent knights charging into a trap, their assumed signal actually the death throes of a wounded comrade's instrument. What made these musical codes so enduring was their adaptability. Unlike written ciphers that required parchment or trained scribes, a melody could be carried in memory, modified on the fly, and transmitted across languages. A Mongol scout might whistle a 5-note pattern to indicate the width of a river crossing, while a Venetian gondolier's song could detail the night's smuggling routes. Even children's rhymes held layered meanings. Nursery tunes in occupied territories often contained mocking references to enemy commanders, their innocent lyrics masking rebel propaganda. Yet the true mastery lay in the listening. For every coded melody, there were ears trained to decode it, musicians who could distinguish between a simple mistake and deliberate sabotage, between a singer's fatigue and a warning too dangerous to speak aloud. In a world where trust was scarce, music became the one language that could both conceal and reveal, its notes dancing on the edge of betrayal. To the uninitiated, it was just sound. To those who knew the key, it was the difference between life and death. There's a special kind of cruelty in hearing your own anthem played by the hands of your conquerors. Picture the scene: a defeated army, battered and broken, forced to stand in silence as their sacred hymns, the very songs that once stirred their hearts to courage, are twisted into a jeering parody by the victors. The melody is the same, but every note now carries the weight of humiliation. This was psychological warfare at its most refined, where music became a scalpel, slicing away at an enemy's sense of self. After the Battle of Agincourt, English archers reportedly sang French drinking songs as they stripped the dead, turning familiar tavern tunes into a dirge for fallen knights. The message was clear: your culture, your pride, even your grief now belong to us. But the true power of these stolen anthems lay in their duality. The same song that could crush morale in one moment might ignite fury in another. When the Spanish reclaimed Granada from the Moors in 1492, they didn't just raise their own banners. They deliberately revived old Visigothic chants that hadn't been heard in centuries, a sonic declaration that the land's ancient Christian identity had been restored. To the defeated, it was erasure; to the victors, resurrection. Music didn't just document history, it rewrote it in real time, with every note a stroke of the pen. The most devastating examples weren't always grand anthems. Sometimes it was the smallest, most intimate melodies that cut deepest. Scottish clansmen captured after Culloden were forced to listen as redcoat regiments played their beloved pibroch laments on confiscated bagpipes, the instrument's drones now marching in lockstep with the enemy's drums. For men who believed the pipes carried the voices of their ancestors, this was sacrilege. Yet decades later, when those same tunes surfaced in Jacobite uprisings, their reclaimed notes became embers sparking rebellion anew. A song that had been weaponized against them now turned back on their oppressors like a blade pulled from one's own wound. What made this tactic so potent was its manipulation of shared memory. Every army's music was woven with stories of home, of heroism, of lost loves. To hear those stories defiled struck deeper than any insult. Ottoman soldiers occupying Hungarian forts would play distorted versions of local folk songs, slowing the tempos to funeral marches or splicing in dissonant notes. The effect was visceral. A melody that should have conjured images of harvest dances or wedding feasts now evoked only violation. Conversely, when Hungarian partisans later infiltrated those same forts, their whistled fragments of the original tunes became secret handshakes in sound, rallying allies without a word. The ultimate irony: the very songs meant to break men often forged unbreakable bonds. After the English banned Welsh archers from singing their native Penillion following Glyndwr's revolt, the melodies survived in whispered fragments, passed down like contraband. By the time Henry V needed those same archers at Agincourt, Their forbidden harmonies had become a secret weapon, sung not just for pride, but as acts of defiance centuries in the making. Music, it turned out, could be captured but never truly owned. Like water seeping through stone, it always found a way to wear down the conqueror's walls. On the open sea, where fog could swallow entire fleets and darkness turned allies into phantoms, music wasn't just useful, it was survival. Picture a Venetian galley lost in the mist off Crete, its crew straining to hear the deep, resonant blasts of a bucina horn cutting through the damp air. That sound was more than a signal. It was a lifeline, the only thread connecting ships that might otherwise collide in the gloom. Naval warfare moved to the rhythm of sound, where a single misplaced note could mean drifting into enemy waters or rowing straight into a reef. Unlike land battles where banners and shouts could guide troops, the sea demanded a different kind of order, one written in melodies and beats. The secret to a galley's deadly speed lay in its drummers. A skilled tamburo didn't just keep time, he was the engine of the ship, his hands dictating the pull of every oar. Mediterranean war galleys relied on this precision, their drums striking a tempo that could shift instantly from a steady cruise to a battle sprint. Too slow and the ship became a floating target, too fast and the rowers would exhaust themselves before the fight even began. The Ottomans took this science further, using different drum patterns to signal complex maneuvers. A rapid triplet might mean veer port, while a series of alternating beats ordered oarsmen to reverse direction without missing a stroke. To silence those drums mid-battle wasn't just a pause, it was a trap. Savvy admirals would suddenly mute their percussion, leaving enemy crews straining to hear their vanished prey, only to have galleys erupt from behind waves with oars already at full speed. Vikings understood this power long before the age of cannon. Their longships moved like living things, not because of some mystical bond between warrior and vessel, but because every oarsman chanted in perfect unison. These weren't just songs, they were living metronomes, their verses structured to match the pull of the oars. Ah, then ah, ither Allah, they'd roar, Odin owns you all, in each syllable timed to the dip and rise of blades in water. The effect was terrifying to coastal villages waking to the sound of dozens of voices echoing across fjords, their rhythm telegraphing impassable speed. Even more chilling was the moment those chants stopped. Silence on the water meant the longships had landed, their crews already slipping ashore like ghosts. But the sea had its own orchestra, and its instruments were anything but delicate. The crash of oars against waves, the groan of timbers under strain, the shriek of grappling hooks biting into hulls, these were the percussion of naval combat. During the Battle of Lepanto, witnesses described the air itself vibrating with sound, Spanish trumpets clashing with Ottoman zurna pipes, the thunder of galleys colliding, and beneath it all, the relentless pounding drums that kept Christian rowers moving even as arrows rained down. Sailors didn't just listen for commands, they navigated by ear, using the pitch of enemy hulls to gauge distance or the echo of their own horns bouncing off cliffs to avoid shipwreck. The cruelest trick the sea played was turning allies into enemies through sound alone. In 1284, a Genoese fleet patrolling the Aegean mistook the harmonic chants of Byzantine rowers for Sicilian raiders, unleashing a volley of crossbow bolts before realizing their error. After that, the Byzantines adopted dissonant, jarring melodies for their galleys' music so intentionally ugly no ally could confuse it. Even the weather became a weapon. English ships harassing the Spanish Armada would wait for wind shifts to carry their drumbeats farther, making their numbers seem multiplied. A single drum, played just right against the cliffs of Dover, could sound like an entire fleet lying in wait. In the end, naval warfare wasn't fought on water. It was fought in the space between sounds. A captain's skill wasn't measured just by how well he read the stars, but by how finely he tuned his ears. The sea was the first great acoustic battlefield, where every wave distorted truth and every note carried the weight of survival. To sail into battle was to step into a symphony where the musicians couldn't see each other, only listen and pray they understood the song. Church bells tolling across a medieval countryside usually meant comfort, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours, celebrating weddings. But in wartime, those same bronze voices became something far darker. Imagine the terror of hearing your village bells, those familiar guardians of daily life, suddenly clanging in frantic, uneven bursts, not to guide but to warn. This was the genius of repurposing sacred sound for war, turning a symbol of community into a weapon of chaos. When attackers laid siege to a town, their first move was often silencing the bells, either by seizing the bell tower or cutting the ropes. Without those bronze sentinels, a settlement couldn't rally its defenders or call for help, leaving it mute and vulnerable as wolves circling a flock. But defenders fought back with sound too. In moments of crisis, they'd abandon the measured peals of religious ritual and instead unleash a cacophony, swinging bells wildly, creating a dissonant roar meant to disorient invaders. The effect was visceral. Bells weren't just loud, their deep, resonant tones could travel for miles, vibrating through stone and bone alike. During the Siege of Orleans, French defenders turned the city's churches into sonic weapons, their discordant ringing amplifying the confusion as Joan of Arc's forces struck. To attacking English troops, the noise wasn't just an alarm, it was a physical barrier, a wall of sound that seemed to warp distance and direction, making every alleyway feel like a potential ambush. Some commanders took this auditory warfare to startling extremes. The Burgundians deployed bell carts, wagons lined with dozens of small bronze bells that jangled with every bump and rut in the road. Rolled ahead of an advancing army, these mobile noise machines created a shimmering curtain of sound, masking the crunch of marching boots or the creak of siege engines being positioned. It was auditory camouflage centuries before electronics, using pure dissonance to make an army's movements unpredictable. Swiss mercenaries adapted the tactic, hanging bells from their pikes during night marches, the gentle chimes disguising the clatter of armor until they were practically on top of their enemies. What made bells uniquely terrifying was their cultural weight. These weren't anonymous noises, they were voices communities had trusted for generations. When the Ottomans captured Constantinople, they didn't just silence the city's famed bells, they melted them down into cannon, literally reforging sacred sound into instruments of destruction. Conversely, when Spanish forces retook Granada, their first act was ringing church bells that had been mute under Moorish rule, a sonic reclaiming of conquered space. The message was unmistakable: who controls the bells controls the very rhythm of life. Perhaps the most chilling use of bells was their absence. After the massacre at Béziers during the Albigensian Crusade, survivors reported the eerie silence of unringing bells as the worst horror of all. No alarm had been sounded, no last call to arms, just hollow towers where familiar tones should have been. In that void, people realized too late that their world had already ended. Bells didn't just signal danger, their silence was the sound of surrender, of time itself running out. And that quiet, more than any battle cry, was what truly shook the soul. A donkey's bray or a sparrow's chirp might seem harmless until it's the last sound you hear before an ambush. Medieval warfare's most ingenious tricksters didn't just use instruments to deceive, they enlisted the animal kingdom itself as co-conspirators. Picture a moonlit valley where an advancing army hears the rhythmic thud of distant drums growing louder. But when scouts investigate, they find no soldiers, just goats tethered to trees. their restless hooves kicking makeshift drums strapped to their backs. This was sonic warfare at its most primal, turning livestock into living instruments of illusion. The Ottomans perfected this ruse during their Balkan campaigns, leaving entire hillsides echoing with false cadences that made outnumbered garrisons flee without a single arrow being loosed. Birds became unwitting messengers of death. Hunters had long mimicked animal calls, but commanders realized these skills could sow chaos on the battlefield. During the Hussite Wars, Bohemian rebels used wooden whistles to replicate the precise trills of thrushes, a sound German knights associated with their own scouts signaling safety. Lured into dense forests by these fabricated birdsongs, entire cavalry units would ride straight into pits lined with sharpened stakes. The French turned this deception into an art form during the Italian Wars, crafting intricate metal whistles that mimicked nightingales. To enemy sentries, the woods seemed alive with harmless birds. In reality, each melodic note marked the position of approaching mercenaries. Even the clink of a horse's bridle could be weaponized. Mongol riders fastened tiny bronze bells to their mounts' harnesses, not for decoration, but to amplify their numbers. 100 horsemen might sound like 1,000 when their tack jingled in perfect unison, a trick that sent Armenian defenders fleeing from what they believed was an unstoppable horde. The Swiss took the opposite approach, muffling their cavalry's gear with felt wrappings to create ghostly silent charges. In one notorious incident at Nancy, Burgundian knights mistook these soundless riders for a mirage until Swiss lances were already piercing their ranks. The most chilling animal sound of all, though, was silence. Savvy commanders knew that sudden quiet in nature could unnerve troops more than any noise. English longbowmen at Crecy reportedly held their positions so still that birds resumed singing overhead until the French advance triggered a flurry of wings, the birds' panicked flight serving as an accidental signal to loose arrows. Nature itself had become a conductor in this deadly orchestra, its rhythms hijacked to deceive, terrify, and kill. When war turned the wilderness into a weapon, even the innocent croak of a frog might herald doom. Silence could be more terrifying than any war cry when wielded with precision. The Hussite rebels of 15th century Bohemia mastered this unnerving tactic, turning the absence of sound into a weapon sharper than any blade. Picture their infamous war wagons creeping forward at dusk, wheels muffled with rags, armored soldiers holding their breath inside. To enemy sentries scanning the tree line, the world seemed still, until those deceptively harmless carts rolled within paces of the camp. Then, in a heartbeat, the night exploded. Wooden panels dropped like drawbridges, revealing a wall of screaming men, their war drums hammering sudden thunder while flaming arrows arced overhead. The effect wasn't just surprise, it was physiological sabotage. After minutes of straining into silence, the brain's threat response went haywire at the abrupt cacophony. Knights fumbled with visors they couldn't see through, horses reared into their own lines, and by the time the chaos registered, the Hussites were already among them with hooked flails and pikes. This wasn't random violence, it was acoustic science centuries ahead of its time. Modern studies reveal why the tactic worked so well. When the human ear detects sudden loud noises after prolonged quiet, the brain floods the body with adrenaline, triggering a freeze response. The Hussites, though they didn't understand the biology, honed the effect through trial and error. Their wagon forts became mobile theaters of psychological terror, each one a stage for the same brutal performance. First the creeping dread of silence, then the sensory overload of clashing metal, splintering wood, and the guttural chants of Kataj Jesu Boji Bojivnasai, ye who are warriors of God. Defenders who'd stood firm against conventional charges would break formation instantly, their discipline shattered by the sheer whiplash of sound. The genius lay in the contrast. Swiss mercenaries might terrify foes with their relentless drumming, and Ottoman Mater bands could overwhelm with sheer volume, but the Hussites proved that terror lived in the transition. They weaponized the gap between expectation and reality, letting their enemies' own imaginations do the work. A sentry staring into blackness would start seeing movement in every shadow, hearing threats in the rustle of leaves only for the real attack to come from an unexpected angle. Even their wagons played a role in the deception. Designed with hinged panels that could drop to form bridges or barricades, their sudden clatter provided the percussion to this macabre symphony, transforming what looked like supply carts into instant fortresses mid-battle. Other armies adapted the principle with chilling creativity. During the Wars of the Roses, Yorkist archers would hold their volleys until the last possible moment, letting the creak of hundreds of drawn bowstrings be the only warning before arrows blotted out the sky. Russian streltsy units advanced in total silence, their long pikes leveled, before unleashing coordinated gunfire at 20 paces close enough to see the whites of their enemies' widening eyes. But perhaps no one refined the art of sonic ambush like the Spanish tercios in the Netherlands. Their musketeers learned to hold fire during foggy nights, allowing the damp air to muffle approaching footsteps until their volleys erupted like lightning from the mist. The aftermath was often more devastating than the bullets themselves. Panicked troops would sometimes trample their own comrades in the blind rush to escape what seemed like an attack by invisible demons. What made these tactics so enduring was their adaptability. The same principles worked whether you were a peasant rebellion with makeshift weapons or a royal army with gunpowder. Silence didn't discriminate, it magnified whatever followed. And in an era when most battles were won or lost in the span of minutes, that split-second advantage of paralysis could decide empires. The next time you're startled by a sudden noise in the dark, remember, that jolt of fear you feel is the ghost of medieval warfare, still whispering its oldest lesson. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't what you hear, it's what you don't hear until it's too late. War wasn't just chaos, it was theater, and every great performance needed a score. While the Aztecs used the hollow wail of conch shells and the relentless pounding of sacrifice drums to mark their captives' fate, European warfare had its own chilling rituals set to music. Picture two armored knights circling each other at dawn, their breath fogging the cold air, when suddenly a lone trumpet pierces the silence, not a battle cry but a formal challenge. This was the trompette des minstrels, a specialized instrument whose sharp, clear notes signaled the start of a judicial duel. Every flourish of the horn carried legal weight, turning combat into ceremony. The music didn't just accompany the fight, it dictated its rhythm with specific fanfares marking when combatants could advance, rest, or deliver the final blow. To ignore these acoustic rules was to forfeit both honor and divine favor, but the most haunting melodies were reserved for the fallen. In the midst of the Battle of Agincourt, where arrows darkened the sky and mud choked the dying, French and English forces alike would pause their slaughter to honor dead nobility with planctus improvised laments sung by battlefield chaplains. These weren't tidy hymns, they were raw, dissonant outpourings of grief, their melodies bending under the weight of loss. Soldiers who'd been hacking at each other moments earlier would stand motionless as the dirges rose, the music forcing them to confront the humanity of the men they'd killed. The effect was so profound that during the Crusades, Muslim chroniclers noted how Frankish knights' funeral chants unnerved their troops more than any war cry. Death was expected. Mourning at mid-battle felt like a violation of war's unwritten rules. Some rituals blurred the line between sacred and profane. The Teutonic Knights, before charging Lithuanian pagans, would form a circle to sing Christ ist erstanden, Christ is risen, while slowly speeding the tempo until it became a frenzied battle hymn. What began as Easter devotion twisted into a war trance, the music whipping knights into a state where religious ecstasy and bloodlust became indistinguishable. Conversely, the Swiss Confederacy turned funerals into psychological warfare. After victories at Morgarten and Sempach, they'd parade captured enemy banners through their villages to the slow beat of muffled drums, the same rhythms used for their own dead. The message was cruel in its artistry. Your symbols of pride are now our mourners' props. The macabre brilliance of these rituals lay in their duality. Music could sanctify violence or strip it bare, sometimes in the same battle. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the famed 1520 summit between Francis I and Henry VIII jousting matches were preceded by elaborate fanfares composed to mirror each king's heraldry. But when real war erupted between them years later, those same trumpets blasted distorted versions of the once celebratory tunes, a sonic middle finger set to music. Even the instruments themselves became actors in this theater. The oliphant, a horn made from elephant tusk, wasn't just a tool, it was a relic, said to have been wielded by Roland at Roncesvalles Pass. When French nobles sounded it in battle centuries later, they weren't just signaling, they were summoning ghosts. What made these performances so devastating was their inevitability. Every soldier knew the score by heart. The challenge fanfare before combat, the death knells after, the victory dances that might one day be another man's dirge. War wasn't just fought with steel and sinew. It was composed, rehearsed, and staged, with every note ensuring the audience never forgot the spectacle's true cost. The music didn't soften the brutality, it underscored it, turning each clash into a sonnet written in blood and breath. And like any great tragedy, the final act always ended the same way, with silence, heavy and absolute where the music had been. History often paints medieval warfare as a male-dominated symphony, but women weren't just silent witnesses, they were composers, conductors, and soloists in this brutal orchestra. Take Joan of Arc's march to Orleans in 1429. Chroniclers describe her not as a lone figure, but as the heart of a moving chorus, her troops singing hymns like Roules Timbres. As they advanced, their voices didn't just boost morale, they transformed into audible proof of her divine mission. To the besieged French, these melodies were hope incarnate. To the English, they were psychological warfare, proof that a peasant girl could command the very air around her. Joan understood something generals often missed. A woman's voice carried unique power, cutting through the noise of battle with an authority that felt otherworldly. Behind castle walls, noblewomen wielded music as deftly as any sword. During sieges, they'd lead choirs of servants and children in sacred songs from the ramparts, their clear voices piercing the clamor of combat below. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, chroniclers note how the Countess of Aumale's psalms echoed over the besiegers' camp, a deliberate act of defiance that forced attackers to endure not just arrows, but the haunting certainty that their enemies still believed God was on their side. These weren't spontaneous outbursts, they were calculated performances. A well-timed Ave Maria could steady trembling hands on crossbows, while a rousing folk tune might shame weary defenders into one last stand. Some women orchestrated wars from courts rather than battlements. Elena of Aquitaine, the medieval world's ultimate power broker, kept a stable of troubadours to spin victories into legend and defeats into martyrdom. When her son Richard the Lionheart was captured, her poets flooded Europe with ballads portraying him as a chivalric saint, music so persuasive it helped squeeze ransom gold from nobles' coffers. Meanwhile, in Muslim Spain, the poetess Walada bint al-Mustakfi used her salon to craft verses celebrating resistance against Christian advances, her words memorized and sung by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. The most overlooked contributors were the anonymous women who kept war's musical traditions alive. In villages from Scotland to Sicily, mothers taught sons the battle chants of their forefathers, while tavern keepers preserved rebel songs under occupiers' noses. A Welsh manuscript from the Glyndwr Rebellion reveals how women smuggled harp tunes in their weaving patterns, the thread's colors corresponding to notes of forbidden anthems. Even nuns got involved. Convents like Fontevraud Abbey doubled as repositories for martial music, their choir books preserving the very songs kings tried to erase. What made women's roles so pivotal was the cultural weight their voices carried. In an era that idealized female purity, a noblewoman's song from the walls wasn't just encouragement, it was a reminder of what defenders stood to lose. Conversely, when peasant women like Joan took up war hymns, it shattered class and gender norms, making their music doubly unsettling to enemies. The battlefield chorus wasn't just male tenors and basses, it was sopranos and altos weaving through the chaos, turning war into a duet between steel and song. And long after the weapons fell silent, it was often women who decided which melodies would be remembered, and which would fade like echoes on a bloodied field. The sham's piercing screech wasn't just music, it was the sound of necessity screaming across centuries. Picture a medieval craftsman hunched over his workbench, carving reeds and widening bore holes not for beauty, but for battlefield survival. This crude ancestor of the oboe didn't evolve in concert halls. It was forged in the crucible of war, where being heard meant the difference between order and slaughter. Unlike the delicate flutes it replaced, the sham's double reed could blast through howling winds and clanging armor with the subtlety of a battle axe. Its very design was a rebellion against nature, a wooden tube twisted to project sound like a weapon, capable of rattling teeth at 200 paces. When Swiss mercenaries marched behind sham players at the Battle of Nancy, the instrument's nasal shriek cut through snowstorms so fiercely that Burgundian horses panicked before the pikes even leveled. Metallurgy didn't just improve swords, it revolutionized sound itself. Early medieval horns made from animal tusks or hollowed wood could barely carry across a tournament field. But by the 14th century, bronze and silver trumpets coiled like serpents, their gleaming tubes amplifying every breath into a commanding bellow. The German Bucine grew so long, often over 6 feet, that players needed harnesses to support their weight while riding. These weren't instruments, they were sonic lances, their metallic timbre chosen specifically to mimic the terrifying ring of unsheathing steel. At the Siege of Harfleur, Henry V's trumpeters used newly forged brass instruments to replicate exact patterns of English longbow volleys, turning their horns into auditory decoys that lured French defenders into wasting arrows on empty fields. Drums underwent their own brutal metamorphosis. What began as simple animal skin timbres strapped to belts exploded into massive tabard drums taller than the men who beat them. Their frames thickened to withstand marching miles, their heads tensioned with ropes that could be tightened mid-battle to adapt to damp conditions. The Ottomans took this further, crafting cursed drums so vast they required camel transport, their deep, resonant booms not just keeping time but mimicking earthquake tremors. During the 1456 siege of Belgrade, these monstrous drums pounded at irregular intervals, their unpredictable vibrations making defenders constantly second-guess whether the shaking beneath their feet was music or mining sappers tunneling beneath the walls. What's fascinating is how these innovations bled back into civilian life. The sham's volume made it perfect for outdoor festivals, giving birth to the modern oboe. War trumpets became ceremonial instruments for royalty, their once terrifying blasts now announcing coronations. Even the relentless pulse of marching drums evolved into the complex polyrhythms of Renaissance dance music. War didn't just borrow from art, it sculpted it, leaving behind instruments that carried the ghosts of battle in every note. The next time you hear an oboe's plaintive melody or a trumpet's triumphant fanfare, listen closer. Beneath the beauty, you might still hear the echo of armies moving in the dark. The last note of a battle hymn didn't mark the end of war's cruelty, it signaled the start of a different kind of struggle. Amid the groans of the wounded and the stench of bloodied earth, survivors turned to music not as a weapon but as a salve. Medieval battlefields left scars deeper than sword cuts, and the songs that followed were less about celebration than survival. Picture a group of English archers after Agincourt, their hands still trembling from the slaughter, quietly humming the same drinking tunes they'd sung in taverns before marching to war. Those familiar melodies weren't just nostalgia, they were lifelines pulling men back from the edge of shock with the rhythm of ordinary life. Laments for the dead were more than ritual, they were psychological triage. When Scottish clans gathered their fallen after Bannockburn, women would lead coronachs, improvised wails that gave shape to collective grief. These weren't polished compositions but raw, dissonant outpourings, their uneven phrases mirroring the fractured minds of those who sang them. Chroniclers note how soldiers who couldn't shed tears would suddenly find release when a particular melody unlocked their numbness, as if the music had reached into their chests and loosened the knots there. The Welsh took this further with Pannilian mourning songs, where harpists deliberately used unresolved harmonies to reflect the unfinished lives of the slain, a sonic metaphor that helped communities process loss without words. Victory dances served a darker purpose than they seemed. The spinning, stomping circles of French carols or German Reigen weren't just displays of joy, they were kinetic exorcisms. Physicians of the time observed that soldiers who danced after combat suffered fewer fevered humors, or what we'd now recognize as PTSD symptoms. The relentless rhythm and physical exertion purged the body of battle's adrenaline, while the communal singing rebuilt shattered bonds of trust. Even the church reluctantly endorsed these practices, seeing how a harvest dance could prevent the soldier's melancholy that often led to desertion or suicide. Some rituals blurred the line between therapy and tactical necessity. The Teutonic Knights required surviving brothers to sing the Dies Irae beside mass graves, its vivid imagery of divine judgment forcing them to confront the cost of their crusading zeal. Meanwhile, Ottoman Mater bands played slower, mournful versions of their battle marches during retreats, using music to methodically drain the army's collective rage and prevent reckless counterattacks. These weren't spontaneous expressions of grief but calculated interventions, leveraging music's power to regulate emotion on a massive scale. The most profound healing often came from unexpected sources. Troubadours traveling with armies would collect the names of the dead, weaving them into ballads that transformed individual losses into shared history. A French knight who froze in terror at the sight of a burning village might later hear his experience sung back to him with new meaning, not as shame but as a cautionary tale of war's toll. These songs became living memorials, allowing trauma to be carried not as a secret burden, but as a story that could be passed from one generation to the next without breaking them. What medieval societies understood intuitively, science now confirms. Music rewires the brain after violence. The rhythmic predictability of a lament can stabilize a traumatized mind, while the communal act of singing restores severed social bonds. When a 14th century monk wrote that music knits up the unraveled sleeve of care, he wasn't just being poetic, he was documenting humanity's oldest form of battlefield medicine, one that healed not with herbs or bandages, but with vibrations in the air and the catharsis of shared sound. The true aftermath of war wasn't counted in corpses or captured flags. but in the fragile, persistent melodies that help the living remember how to be human again. The same drum beats that once set the pace for charging knights now keep time for village festivals, and the war horns that struck fear into enemies have become the fanfares of royal weddings. History has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal sounds, preserving them not as weapons but as cultural heirlooms. Take the Agincourt Carol, its triumphant melody still sung in English cathedrals 6 centuries after it celebrated Henry V's bloody victory. The lyrics de O gracious Anglia read pro Victoria, England, give thanks to God for victory, once stirred soldiers to slaughter, but today it's a choral piece performed by schoolchildren, its martial origins fading into reverence. High in the Swiss Alps, another echo of warfare survives in an unexpected form. The piercing yodels that now entertain tourists began as coded signals between mountain militias, their sharp, bouncing notes designed to carry across treacherous valleys. A single broken melody might warn of approaching Habsburg troops, while a rapid series of falsetto leaps could coordinate ambushes. Over time, these survival tools morphed into pastoral entertainment, their urgency replaced by charm, yet the techniques remain unchanged. Modern yodelers still use the same vocal gymnastics medieval centuries did, proof that artistry often sprouts from necessity. The transformation isn't just European. In Japan, the thundering taiko drums that once rallied samurai now headline cultural festivals, their rhythms stripped of menace but not power. The Ottoman mater marches that terrified crusader armies evolved into Turkey's ceremonial matron bands, their costumes meticulously preserved even as their music became spectacle. Even the bagpipes, once banned by English conquerors for their role in Scottish rebellions, now draw crowds at weddings and parades, their warlike drones softened by nostalgia. What's fascinating is how these melodies shed their original meanings without losing their emotional weight. A fife and drum corps playing at a colonial reenactment might use the same quickstep that ordered British volleys at Bunker Hill, but today's listeners hear patriotism, not panic. The Swedish Vikingsång, a haunting chant once used to steady oarsmen before raids, now features in folk albums, its primal energy channeled into artistry rather than aggression. Music's ability to outlive its context is a testament to its resilience. What was forged in violence can be reforged into identity. Yet traces of the old terror linger if you know where to listen. The Marseillaise, France's national anthem, began as a Revolutionary War cry with lyrics about watering fields with impure blood. The Ukrainian dummy epics, sung to the twang of the kobza, preserve Cossack battle laments word for word. Even children's games hold shadows. The rhythmic clapping of a tisket, a tasket mirrors medieval sword drills. These aren't just artifacts, they're proof that culture never fully erases war's imprint. It simply repurposes it, letting melodies that once heralded death now celebrate life. The next time you hear a folk tune at a county fair or a hymn in a chapel, listen closer. Beneath the familiar notes, you might still catch the whisper of swords being drawn, of drums urging soldiers forward not as a threat, but as a reminder that beauty can rise from even the darkest echoes of our past. The human brain hasn't changed much since the Middle Ages, and that's precisely why medieval musical warfare tactics still send shivers down our spines today. Modern neuroscience reveals that the shrill blast of a war trumpet or the arrhythmic pounding of siege drums didn't just sound terrifying. They hijacked primal neural pathways hardwired for survival. When dissonant sounds like the intentional clashing of cymbals or off-key bagpipe wails hit our ears, the amygdala activates like a tripwire. This tiny fear center, buried deep in the brain, can't distinguish between a 13th century Naka's drum and a snarling predator. It simply floods the body with cortisol, narrowing vision, speeding the pulse, and sabotaging rational thought. Medieval commanders didn't need fMRI scans to recognize this effect. They saw it in the trembling hands of enemy soldiers, the way formations crumbled under sonic assault, and they weaponized it with chilling precision. Rhythm's power over groups is even more profound. Scientists call it entrainment, the phenomenon where individual heartbeats, breaths, and even brainwaves unconsciously sync to an external pulse. On the battlefield, this meant a well-timed drumbeat could transform hundreds of individual fighters into a single, unstoppable machine. Swiss pikemen marching to timbre rhythms didn't just move together. Their very physiology aligned, their collective focus sharpening like a honed blade. Conversely, disrupting that rhythm, say, with a sudden silence or irregular horn blast, could shatter cohesion instantly. The same biological quirk that let armies move as one also made them vulnerable to acoustic sabotage. Loud noises trigger another insidious effect, cognitive overload. Studies show exposure to sounds above 85 decibels, roughly the volume of a bustling medieval market, impairs decision-making as severely as alcohol intoxication. Now imagine the cacophony of a siege, meter bands blaring at 120 decibels equivalent to a jet engine, church bells clanging, and thousands screaming. At that intensity, the prefrontal cortex, the brain's reasoning center, effectively shuts down. Soldiers forgot battle plans, missed commands, and fixated on escape. No wonder defenders often surrendered after days of relentless noise. Their brains were drowning in sound. What's astonishing is how medieval musicians fine-tuned these effects through trial and error. The Ottomans' Zurna pipes, for instance, produce a piercing 2500 Hz tone, the exact frequency range human ears are most sensitive to, ensuring their shrieks cut through even the din of cannon fire. Similarly, the irregular drum patterns used to disorient Crusader knights at Arsuf mirror modern techniques for inducing auditory motion sickness, where conflicting rhythms cause spatial disorientation. These weren't random acts of noise, they were acoustic scalpels probing the mind's weakest points. Perhaps the most haunting revelation is how these ancient tactics persist in contemporary warfare. The US military's use of heavy metal music during the Panama invasion, Israel's sound bombs over Gaza, both exploit the same neural vulnerabilities medieval musicians stumbled upon centuries ago. The instruments have changed, but the science remains unchanged. Sound doesn't just carry messages, it rewires the listener's mind. When a Scottish piper's drone made English knights freeze at Bannockburn, or when Hussite war wagons used sudden silence to trigger panic, they were playing an instrument far more potent than wood or brass. They were playing the human nervous system itself, a weapon no armor could deflect, and one we're only now beginning to fully understand. The eerie wail of a bagpipe may seem worlds apart from the piercing screech of a modern LRAD cannon, but both weapons share the same ancient blueprint, sound as psychological warfare. Today's militaries didn't invent acoustic intimidation. They inherited it from medieval battlefields and refined it with technology. Take the long-range acoustic device, or LRAD, used by navies to repel pirates. Its concentrated beam of sound can cause unbearable pain at 1,500 meters, a high-tech echo of the Ottomans' Zurna pipes, whose shrill tones were deliberately tuned to trigger migraines in besieged defenders. The physics have changed, but the strategy hasn't. Overwhelm the enemy's senses until their will crumbles. Even the playbook of psychological operations feels eerily familiar. During the Iraq War, US troops blared Metallica and Barney the Dinosaur's theme at enemy hideouts, a tactic straight from the Burgundian playbook at Neuse, where discordant music broke defenders' sanity. Modern soldiers might use drones to project voices from the sky, but the principle mirrors medieval minstrels shouting fabricated warnings from hilltops. And when Russian forces recently broadcast fake surrender instructions in Ukrainian, they were recycling a trick the Teutonic Knights used with captured Lithuanian chants. The medium evolves, loudspeakers replace war drums, algorithms replace troubadours, but the goal remains unchanged: weaponize sound to distort reality. Sports stadiums unwittingly preserve these ancient tactics every weekend. Soccer fans' thunderous churns of "Allez, allez, allez" descend directly from the rhythmic war cries of Celtic tribes, designed to unnerve opponents through sheer collective volume. The All Blacks haka, with its stomping and throat-slitting gestures, is a ritualized battle chant repurposed for rugby. Even the Vuvuzella's brain-melting drone at the 2010 World Cup recalled the Hussites' wagon forts, where noise was a weapon of mass disruption. These aren't just traditions, they're genetic memories of acoustic dominance, proving that the line between battlefield and bleachers is thinner than we think. What binds medieval and modern sonic warfare is neuroscience. Studies confirm that irregular noises, whether from a 14th century Naker's drum or a 21st century sonic boom, trigger the amygdala's fight or flight response identically. The LRAD infrasound pulses exploit the same vestibular panic as Mongol horse fiddles, both destabilizing balance and inducing nausea. Even the silence tactics of Swiss mercenaries find their counterpart in modern, acoustic shadows, where special ops teams use noise-canceling tech to move undetected. The tools gleam with silicon now, but they're still playing humanity's oldest auditory tricks. Perhaps the most telling continuity is in music's aftermath. Just as medieval minstrels spun battle trauma into ballads, today's veterans use hip-hop and punk to process PTSD. The Agincourt Carol and Kendrick Lamar's The Art of Peer Pressure serve the same purpose, turning war's chaos into rhythm, its horror into something survivable. Because whether written on parchment or streaming on Spotify, the song remains the same. Sound still shapes fear, forges unity, and when the fighting's done, stitches broken minds back together. Warfare's soundtrack never really changes. It just finds new instruments. Hollywood would have you believe medieval battlefields roared with the complexity of a symphony orchestra, every charge accompanied by layered harmonies and dramatic crescendos. The truth, war music was lean, raw, and ruthlessly practical, more like a hammer than a scalpel. Take the myth of the ever-present bagpipes. While Scottish Highlanders wielded them to terrifying effect, French knights at Agincourt likely advanced to the stark blasts of straight trumpets, and Ottoman armies relied on the shrill zurna rather than Celtic drones. These weren't artistic choices, they were logistical ones. A trumpet's piercing tone carried farther through chaos than any melody, and a drum's rhythm could hold a formation together when shouts dissolved into the clash of steel. Another cinematic fabrication, the idea of intricate, composed battle anthems. In reality, most war music was improvised or built from a handful of repeating patterns. The Swiss Kurehen, for instance, twisted simple herding calls into psychological weapons by altering tempo and volume. No sheet music required. Even the famed Meta bands of the Ottomans, often portrayed as playing complex marches, primarily relied on cyclical rhythms designed to be instantly recognizable through dust and distance. This wasn't music for entertainment, it was acoustic semaphore stripped of all but the most vital elements. The biggest casualty of Hollywood's flair is the omission of silence as a tactical tool. Films love relentless drumbeats, but historical accounts reveal how shrewd commanders weaponized quiet. At Morgarten, Swiss rebels muted their approach entirely. letting the natural creak of armor and crunch of snow betray their enemies instead of drums. Contrast that with the non-stop noise of movie battles, where the absence of sound is treated as a vacuum rather than a strategic choice. Real medieval warfare had dynamic pulses of sound followed by voids where the next note could mean ambush or retreat. Then there's the myth of universality. Pop culture paints war music as a monolith, all bagpipes all the time. In truth, instruments were as regional as dialects. Welsh longbowmen used curved carynx horns to mimic predatory bird screams, while Italian mercenaries favored the tromba d'otterosi, a slide trumpet that could glissando between signals like an auditory flare. Even the humble human voice adapted to terrain. Alpine troops developed yodel-like calls to bounce off mountains, while Dutch rebels used low, droning chants to blend with coastal winds. What's lost in these fictionalized versions isn't just accuracy, but the ingenuity of medieval musicians. Their creations weren't crude prototypes of modern compositions. They were precision tools honed by necessity. A single misplaced note in a trumpet call could scatter allies as surely as an enemy charge, and an overcomplicated rhythm might drown in the din of battle. The real soundtrack of war wasn't a composed masterpiece, it was a language, spare and brutal, where every sound carried the weight of survival. Next time a film scores a medieval clash with electric guitars or full choirs, listen closer. Beneath the glamour, you'll miss the far more compelling truth that history's greatest war music wasn't meant to be heard, it was meant to be felt. You don't need a time machine to stand on a medieval battlefield. Just step into Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum, where the original war trumpets of the Habsburg emperors gleam behind glass. These aren't mere relics, they're frozen sound waves, they're curved brass tubes still taut with the memory of 1,000 blasts that once rallied armies. Run your fingers along the display case, and you're inches from the same metal that touched the lips of musicians who played for Maximilian I's troops. The craftsmanship is startling, some horns engraved with intricate battle scenes, their mouths worn thin by centuries of breath. Nearby, a 15th century timbre drum leans slightly, its animal skin head still stretched taut, as if waiting for the next march. For a more visceral experience, seek out the thunder of living history. Groups like the Company of St. George don't just wear accurate armor, they recreate the sonic landscape of war. At festivals like England's Tewkesbury Medieval Fair, you'll hear their Busine horns cut through the air with the same piercing urgency that once signaled cavalry charges. Their drummers don't keep polite rhythm for tourists. They hammer out the arrhythmic, bone-shaking patterns recorded in Swiss mercenary manuals, the kind that could synchronize a pike square's advance. Watch the crowd's reaction when the shalmei, a medieval shawm, unleashes its nasal shriek. Modern faces flinch just as medieval ones must have. Scholarship breathes new life into these sounds through ensembles like Sequentia and the Boston Camerata. Their reconstructions of Crusader songs or Hussite war hymns aren't guesswork, they're forensic musicology. By cross-referencing manuscripts like the Cantigas de Santa Maria with accounts of battlefield rituals, they've decoded how sacred melodies twisted into war cries. Their performances reveal chilling details, the way a Te Deum might accelerate into a battle tempo, or how Breton soldiers layered plainchant with the clatter of swords on shields. The digital age has shattered barriers to access. The British Library's online archive lets you zoom in on the Luttrell Psalter, where marginalia show trumpeters leading charges. Copenhagen's Royal Library digitized the Wars of the Roses songbook, its notation preserving the very tunes sung in Yorkist camps. For hands-on learners, the Museum of London offers 3D scans of 14th century bone flutes. Download the files, print your own, and blow across the same finger holes that once sounded over Agincourt's mud. What's startling is how these sounds still trigger instinct. Stand before a reconstruction of the 6-foot oliphant horn at the Cluny Museum, and your spine will vibrate at its low C, the same note that warned of Saracen raids. Attend a reenactment where 50 drummers replicate the Ottoman siege cadence, and you'll understand why chroniclers described the noise as the hammer of God. This isn't just history, it's a mirror held up to our primal reflexes. The past's pulse still beats, you just have to learn how to listen. The moment a sacred hymn became a battle cry, medieval warriors crossed an invisible line, not just between armies, but between ethics and expediency. Consider the Teutonic knights chanting Christ ist erstanden as they advanced on pagan villages, their Easter hymn warping into a war trance. Was this piety or perversion? The same question haunted clerics who watched crusaders sing Veni Creator Spiritus before slaughtering civilians at Jerusalem. Sacred music was never meant to bleed, yet in war, even the holiest melodies sharpened into blades. This wasn't just about morale, it was psychological alchemy. When Burgundian forces twisted Provençal love songs into discordant siege noise, they weren't merely attacking ears. They were eroding cultural identity, weaponizing nostalgia until home itself felt contaminated. The Ottomans took it further during the Siege of Rhodes, broadcasting distorted Greek Orthodox chants to demoralize defenders. These weren't battlefield innovations, they were violations turning sound into a solvent for the soul. Yet the era's most chilling ethical line was crossed in silence. At Château-Gaillard, French defenders endured days of muffled drums, a tactic designed to amplify the screams of tortured prisoners. Chroniclers describe how the intermittent sobs of broken men, carried on the wind, shattered morale more effectively than any battering ram. This wasn't strategy, it was theater of cruelty, where music's absence became its own form of violence. Modern parallels glare back at us. The US military's use of blasted Barney songs at Panama's Noriega echoes the Burgundians' dissonant siege music. Israel's sonic booms over Gaza mirror the Ottoman psychological bombardment. Even protesters' drum circles, meant to disorient police, owe their DNA to Swiss mercenaries' arrhythmic timbre patterns. The technology evolves, but the dilemma remains. When does sound stop being communication and start becoming coercion? Medieval thinkers grappled with this too. Philosophers like Aquinas condemned musical deception that unmanned the spirit, while Islamic jurists forbade distorting the adhan call to prayer during sieges. Yet for every principled stand, pragmatism won battles. The Welsh who smuggled rebel songs in harp patterns, the Hungarian nuns who taught coded laments, all justified their sonic subterfuge as survival. War's oldest lesson echoes here. Ethics bend where stakes are highest. Perhaps the sharpest irony lies in music's aftermath. The same Agincourt carol that celebrated slaughter became a hymn of national healing. The Mater marches that terrified crusaders now delight tourists in Istanbul. Time scrubs sound clean of context, but the stains remain, if you know where to listen. When we debate today's acoustic weapons, we're not just arguing decibels or frequencies. We're asking what lines we'll cross and what melodies we'll sacrifice in the name of victory. The Middle Ages never answered that question. Neither have we. 21st century technology is peeling back layers of time to reveal how medieval battlefields truly resonated, not through guesswork, but through acoustic archaeology, where science and history collide in spectacular ways. Picture researchers using laser scans of surviving instruments like the Vienna horn, a 6-foot-long bronze artifact from the 1400s, to 3D print exact replicas. When played in reconstructed castle courtyards, these horns produce frequencies that interact with stone walls in unexpected ways, proving commanders strategically placed musicians to exploit natural echoes. At the University of York, archaeologists mapped the sonic landscape of Towton, the bloodiest battle on English soil, by analyzing terrain and period instrument ranges. Their finding, the Lancastrian army's drum corps likely positioned themselves near a shallow valley, creating a sound funnel that made their forces seem twice as large, a trick straight from the Burgundian playbook, now confirmed by physics. Artificial intelligence is decoding secrets even medieval musicians didn't know they embedded. A team at Cambridge fed thousands of Crusader-era musical notations into machine learning algorithms, uncovering startling consistencies in tempo shifts before charges. The data revealed how Frankish composers used rising melodic sequences to trigger adrenaline responses, essentially hacking the nervous system centuries before neuroscience existed. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, AI analysis of Ottoman meter compositions exposed hidden mathematical patterns. Certain drum rhythms aligned precisely with human heart rates during stress, maximizing physiological impact. These weren't just songs, they were precision-engineered weapons of mass disorientation. The most revelatory work happens in virtual reality labs, where historians and sound engineers collaborate to recreate full sensory battle experiences. Donning VR headsets at Prague's Charles University, test subjects reported visceral reactions to simulated Hussite war wagon assaults, not just to the visuals, but to the spatial audio of chanting soldiers, creaking wheels, and sudden silences. Many instinctively ducked when the digital tabor drums switched to attack tempo, proving these sounds still trigger primal fear responses after 600 years. Projects like Oxford's Sonic Past initiative go further, using bone conduction headphones to simulate how vibrations from Swiss pikemen's marching would have traveled through the ground before reaching enemy ears, a tactile dimension of warfare previously lost to time. What's emerging is a paradigm shift in how we understand medieval warfare. Gone is the simplistic view of music as mere accompaniment. These technologies prove it was a strategic ecosystem. Spectral analysis of Scottish pibroch reveals how specific pipe harmonics could carry further in rainy conditions, explaining Highlanders' tactical advantage in damp climates. X-ray fluorescence scans on Crusader-era cymbals show deliberate alloy mixes to produce harsh, metallic tones that cut through desert winds. Even humble items like bone whistles found in Viking graves, when scanned and digitally restored, demonstrate sophisticated pitch modulation for coordinating ship landings in fog. The frontier keeps expanding. In Barcelona, linguists are training AI to reconstruct lost battle languages from musical mnemonics. Welsh archers reportedly encoded range estimations in their harp tunes. At MIT, physicists are modeling how Gothic cathedral acoustics amplified Gregorian chant during sieges, turning sacred spaces into psychological amplifiers. And in a striking fusion of disciplines, geneticists are studying hereditary hearing traits in descendants of medieval trumpeters, seeking clues about how certain families bred musicians capable of producing ear-splitting notes without vocal damage. This isn't just academic curiosity, it's resurrection. Every algorithm-processed manuscript, every VR soundscape, every spectral analysis of a rusted war horn brings us closer to hearing history as the people who made it did. The past isn't silent, we're finally learning how to listen. What began as scholarly detective work is becoming a revolution, proving that medieval warfare's soundtrack wasn't just background noise. It was the operating system of battle itself, waiting centuries for us to reboot its code. From drumbeats that mimicked thunder to trumpets that bent reality, medieval music was far more than background noise. It was architecture for the mind. Imagine standing on a fog-shrouded battlefield, where the air vibrates with the deep, resonant thud of kettle drums, each strike syncing with your heartbeat until fear and rhythm become indistinguishable. This was the invisible engineering of warfare, where sound didn't just accompany conflict, it orchestrated it. Commanders weren't just tacticians, they were composers, crafting sonic landscapes that could rally a broken flank, terrify an enemy into retreat, or even convince a besieged garrison that the very heavens had turned against them. What's astonishing is how these ancient techniques still reverberate today. Modern militaries use sonic booms and LRAD cannons, but the principle remains unchanged. Sound is a lever for the human psyche. When a Scottish piper's drone froze English knights at Bannockburn, or when Ottoman mater bands made castle walls tremble with their thunderous cadences, they were tapping into something primal, a vulnerability hardwired into our brains. Neuroscience now confirms what medieval musicians knew instinctively. Certain frequencies trigger panic, while others forge unbreakable unity. The rhythm of a drum isn't just noise, it's a remote control for the nervous system. Yet the legacy of this sonic warfare isn't confined to battlefields. Walk through any city during a protest, and you'll hear the same tactics repurposed chants synced to stomping feet, drums pacing the crowd like a heartbeat. Sports stadiums echo with war cries disguised as cheers, and even filmmakers manipulate soundtracks to heighten tension, using the same dissonance that once made crusaders falter. The tools have evolved, but the playbook was written centuries ago in the clash of steel and the scream of horns. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. When we dissect how sound shaped the past, we're really studying ourselves, the ways we're still moved, still manipulated by the vibrations in the air around us. Those medieval commanders would smirk at our noise-canceling headphones and curated playlists, knowing we've merely swapped siege drums for earbuds. The battlefield has expanded, but the war for our attention and our emotions rages on. So the next time a song gives you chills or a distant siren makes your pulse quicken, remember, you're feeling the ghostly hand of history, still pulling strings first woven on ancient battlefields. If this dive into the symphony of war struck a chord, don't just listen passively, engage. Smash that like button to signal your own rallying cry. Subscribe to keep the conversation marching forward, and drop a comment below. Which of these sonic strategies shocked you the most? Until next time, keep your ears open. The past isn't silent, it's whispering.